I'm Mark Golub. Welcome to our year in review discussion. In just a few moments, four outstanding observers and writers about the Jewish scene will be sharing their views on what were the most important events in this past Jewish year. And they'll be choosing their Jewish personality of 2022. So I hope you stay with us for a very special edition of L'Chaim.
Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
Well, 2022 was a year of many frustrations and controversies in the Jewish world, as the Israeli people, in their fifth election in 4 years this past November, finally elected a Knesset in which there could be a stable coalition government. And lo and behold, Benjamin Netanyahu was able to play the consummate political game and will be Israel's next prime minister. The third time Bibi will be in that position. And of course, he's already served longer than any other prime minister, longer even than David ben-gvir. But rather than being a source of healing for the Jewish state, the results of this election have caused a firestorm in Israel and throughout the Jewish world, as many people are upset and frightened by the prospect of yet another Netanyahu government, this time based on what is defined as the far, far religious right. Many Jews in Israel and in the diaspora around the world see the end of the state of Israel as we have known it, with a government that may be controlled by ultra-Orthodox parties which seek to delegitimize Reform Judaism in Israel, as well as all non-Orthodox expressions and movements of Judaism, who may try to limit the law of return so as it would not apply to non-Orthodox Jews, and who may well try to impose greater Orthodox law on the social scene of Israel. And these ultra-Orthodox parties will be in consort with extreme nationalist parties, typified by Avi Maoz, a devout advocate of expanding Israeli settlements on the West Bank, and typified by Itamar ben-gvir, a disciple of Meir Kahane, who's had a photograph of Baruch Goldstein hanging in his home, the Jew who machine gun murdered more than 24 Muslims in the midst of prayer. And so that the new Israeli government may chip away at Israeli democracy by limiting the rights extended to Arab Israelis and by implementing anti-Palestinian policies on the West Bank. And all this has prompted some American leaders, such as Abe Foxman, the longtime head of the Anti-Defamation League, to go public with the fact that if Israel forms a government that is racist or theocratic, that for the first time in his life, Abe Foxman may not be able to support the state of Israel. This is a matter of controversy that plagues the greater Jewish community as we prepare to end 2022 and begin 2023. Also this year, the World Zionist Organization met in Basel, Switzerland, to commemorate the first Zionist Congress held in Basel 725 years ago. At the Congress, the world body recognized one Jewish organization and one Jewish leader, the ZOA, the Zionist Organization of America, and its president, Mort Klein, for the leading work ZOA does in defending the State of Israel and the Jewish people. And Mort Klein and ZOA itself is controversial in that it is seen to be on the significant right in the Jewish world. Mort Klein answers, the truth is neither right nor left. But it was interesting to see that only ZOA, of all the Zionist organizations that participated in the Congress, only ZOA was singled out for public approval. Now, speaking of ZOA, the organization was also in the news at the end of the Jewish year, as it chose to honor at their annual ZOA Gala former President Donald Trump, whom a majority of American Jews absolutely detest and abhor. Then, to compound matters, a week after the ZOA dinner, Donald Trump hosted a dinner at Mar-a-Lago with two outrageous, virulent anti-Semites, Kanye West, who talks about DEFCON 3 for the Jews, and longtime Holocaust denier Nick Fuentes. And when the president was asked by ZOA to repudiate the hideous anti-Semitism of his two dinner guests, Donald Trump refused to do so, prompting many in the American Jewish community to echo the refrain penned by Jonathan Tobin that it's time for all American Jews to divorce themselves from supporting Donald Trump to any extent as he begins his run for the Republican presidential nomination. On the international scene, the February invasion of Ukraine by Vladimir Putin's Russia has had a serious impact on hundreds of Holocaust survivors now living in Ukraine, forcing many of them to become refugees again as they flee from war-torn Ukraine to find new homes in neighboring countries. Also in 2022, the Jewish Book of the Year is most likely to be a 650-page memoir edited by Bibi, a gripping and revealing autobiography written by Benjamin Netanyahu by hand on legal pads, one version in Hebrew, another completely separate version in English. Two Jews were awarded Nobel Prizes in economics this year. Former chairman of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, and University of Chicago professor Douglas Diamond for their collaborative research on banks and the financial crisis. At the 2022 Emmys, two Jewish actors took home the statue for the second consecutive year, Julia Garner winning for her portrayal of Ruth Langmore in the hit series Ozark, and Brett Goldstein for his supporting role in the sports series Ted Lasso. And speaking of sports, when the Houston Astros defeated the Philadelphia Phillies to win the World Series in 2022, they were led in part once again by their silver slugging and home run leading third baseman, Alex Bregman, of Congregation Albert in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where he said during his bar mitzvah speech, "I want to be a professional athlete who's a good role model for all the kids who look up to baseball players. A wish Alex has fulfilled well, to the pride of all who follow Jewish athletes." And that's some of what happened in the Jewish year of 2022. And to discuss the greater significance of any of these events, I am so pleased to be joined by 4 individuals for whom I have the greatest respect and affection. If you watch JBS often, you know them all, but let me introduce them to you once again. Eric Yoffie is the past president of the Reform Movement's congregational arm, the URJ, the Union for Reform Judaism. Prior to that, Eric headed ARTSA, the Reform Movement's Zionist organization. Eric is now a commentator on Jewish life, writing for the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, while posting his own blogs on ericyaffi.com. And Eric, it is always wonderful to have you at this table. Thank you for joining us again.
Good to be here.
Stephen Bayme is also an outstanding analyst and commentator of Jewish issues, having recently ended his nearly 40-year career as the longtime director of contemporary Jewish life for the American Jewish Committee, and also heading AJC's Kaufman Institute on American Jewish-Israeli relations. It is wonderful to have you back. We missed you.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Mark.
Laura Adkins is the opinion editor of The Forward. She is an award-winning writer, editor, and speaker, and Laura's work has appeared in the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Washington Post, and in Glamour magazine. And it is always wonderful to have you at this table. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
And David Efune, one of the Jewish community's most astute commentators and analysts of the Jewish scene. He was CEO and editor-in-chief of the Allgemeiner and has moved on with that online newspaper to work on the board of directors. And David is also chairman and publisher of the New York Sun, which is devoted to providing journalism that's value-based, principled, and constitutionalist. And David, it is wonderful always as well to have you at this table. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure is mine.
All 4 of you. It is just wonderful for me. All right, you heard my open, and Eric, you wrote a piece on the whole issue of the Israeli election. But before I ask you to comment on it, is there anything the 4 of you think was missed in this Jewish year that was of particular significance that you want to mention, whether you think it's the most or not? Is it important? Are there things that you would have added to the open? David?
I would have added Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter.
Elon Musk isn't Jewish, is he?
He's not Jewish, but I'd say that it is an event, an occurrence that has very serious significance for the Jewish community. What it does is, really, it opens up, for the first time, really, a main, or one of the main social media platforms. There are a lot of sort of smaller social media platforms, to a new modus operandi in which there is a lot more that is allowed, including the public discussion vis-a-vis Jewish people and Jewish concerns and Israel and beyond. And that comes with challenges, but I would say also opportunities that if we're wise and thoughtful, we can really engage a much wider audience with the issues that are of concern to our community.
Do any of the three of you agree that it is an important event for Jews? Laura?
Beyond hemorrhaging shareholder value, Musk's acquisition of Twitter is actively endangering Jewish journalists and Jewish activists who use the platform.
How?
I have seen anecdotally in the writers that I work with and my direct reports at the Forward a vast proliferation of hate speech and bots that are unchecked. Not to mention that most of the staff of Twitter that was responsible for controlling for hate speech has either been fired or left, most notably Yoel Roth, a Jewish man who is also an LGBTQ American who Musk is endangering by coming after on the platform. And finally, I would just say that while it is a very important Jewish event, Twitter is only used by a tiny segment of Americans. Many of those happen to be Jewish, but thankfully, although Musk is destroying the company, he's not destroying public discourse in a meaningful way for most Americans.
Steve, what's your sense?
If it were up to me, I'd abolish Twitter completely. It coarsens the discussion. In other words, I see very little value in it in terms of trying to persuade anyone of a viewpoint. If you want to go on record for something, Twitter is useful. And obviously, if you're trying to win an election, it's also useful. But in terms of what it adds to American culture, let alone American Jewish culture, I'm upset about the way it's become such a cause célèbre in certain circles. Whereas I think Laura's correct in saying it's a certain grouping. Whereas most discourse, I would hope, is more thoughtful, more intelligent, and ultimately more persuasive.
Eric?
The web has changed our world, and it's had a particular impact on the Jewish community. The most important thing that's happened this year, going back to your words, is anti-Semitism, 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 which has burst out in a way that we wouldn't have thought imaginable 5 to 7 years ago. The web plays a very big role in that. It's not the only factor. It's a hugely important factor for us. Not only Twitter, but all the various social platforms and various types of social media. So as a Jew, when I look at social media, that's what concerns me. Then we could talk about, what, if anything, can be done about it. I think there ought to be extraordinary trepidation at the extent to which social media has promoted Jew hatred throughout the world during the past year. Is there going to be some kind of moderation as sort of the standard for the major platforms? Can we assume that there will be a group of people who will be doing their best in order to eliminate hatred and bigotry of all forms, and in particular, anti-Semitism? That has been a hit or miss project up to now, but what we've seen with Elon Musk is, as Laura indicated, it's clearly moving in the opposite direction. Right now, the tendency is to open things up. Musk talks about, he's an absolutist on free speech. First of all, let it be said, there are no free speech issues when it comes to Twitter. Twitter is a private corporation. So you don't have free speech rights on a private in a private corporation. If you go to make use of the services of Twitter, there are no free speech considerations at work here. But the other side to that is the owner of the corporation can either decide to moderate it or not. And what we're seeing now is an increasing tendency not to do so. I don't think it has anything to do with values. I think it has to do with his take on whether or not it's going to increase his profits and benefit his shareholders and get back his money. But what I do know is, they've measured this in a whole series of articles. It was one of the Times a few days ago, in which it talked about the number of tweets that deal specifically with anti-black, anti-Jewish, anti-Asian comments. And those numbers are not up a little bit, they're up a great deal. So if you do away with the moderation, you do away with the attempts to suppress and eliminate, it's going to have an immediate impact. And at a time when anti-Semitism is growing anyway, and you referred to this in your earlier comments, I think that's hugely dangerous for the Jews.
And it's not just online,
So-
if I may, Rabbi Golub. We see a tremendous spillover effect into the real world. If you look at the most recent anti-Semitic mass shootings or attempted mass shootings, you see that the vast majority of those people were either radicalized online or posting online and inspired by others posting online when they were thinking about how to plan their attacks, how to carry out the attacks, and where to target. So it's not just confined to online, unfortunately.
So I think just to sort of respond to some of what's been said here, and also just to clarify, and I'm not his spokesperson, but what Elon Musk will say is that there may be a higher number of tweets, but they have far lower visibility. That's what he's claiming, okay? But the argument that I would make when we talk about anti-Semitism, and obviously the concern over the rise and fall of anti-Semitism, and particularly the rise of anti-Semitism now, is real and serious and significant. But the bigger question that I would say as a community we need to ask ourselves is not whether anti-Semitism is rising and falling, which it has over 2 millennia. There has never been a period in which anti-Semitism has existed. It's come and gone to varying degrees. But what's different today is really the barometer of the tools that we have to fight anti-Semitism and to establish our independence and to have a voice as a people. That is what's different today. It's not how much anti-Semitism there is, it's what tools are available for us to push back. And I think it's important for our community to focus more on that side of the dynamic. And what does that mean? That means we have a state, we have a diplomatic corps, but when Kanye West condemned the Jewish media mafia, I wrote a piece called A Letter on Kanye West from a Jewish media mobster. And the point that I made is that something, it's a privilege for a Jewish person in this country to be able to run a newspaper, to be able to speak on a public platform, to be able to go into a public space or the town hall, today's digital town hall as Twitter has been referred to, and to state our case and to answer to anti-Semites directly and to explain to the world what our purpose is as a people, and very often to set folks straight.
I'm glad you brought it up. It was an interesting discussion. I want to come back to the specifics of the year 2022 in Jewish events. Do either of the three of you have any event you think I missed?
I just think the discussion on anti-Semitism was rooted primarily in Trump, West, and Fuentes. The discussion is much broader. In other words, it's about anti-Semitism on the right, on the left, black-Jewish relations, Muslim-Jewish relations. So in that respect, rooting it entirely in the actions of one individual, as misguided as those were, I don't think exhausts the subject by any stretch
I
of
understand,
imagination.
and I'm glad you said it that way. And what is your sense of black-Jewish relations right now in America?
We've known better periods and we've known worse periods, and I think the challenge is not to allow a particular incident to become normative or paradigmatic. We are going through some issues where sometimes when the media tends to focus on white supremacy when it comes to anti-Semitism. Something like Jersey City or Muncie, those were probably, I guess, last year rather than this year. Those get less coverage. And in that respect, Jewish leaders have a built-in desire to enhance black-Jewish relations, and that's all to the good, and it should be encouraged. And abandoning the field of black-Jewish relations is a very poor idea, although I imagine there were those who would advocate that. Reverend Warnock, for example, in Georgia, was actually elected in many ways by 100,000 Jews, or close to it, 70,000, who voted for him over Herschel Walker. That's something I applaud. So to say black-Jewish relations have become negative, I think, is to exaggerate certain incidents that perhaps should have been better covered, but at the same time, and not necessarily paradigmatic of what's going on.
Okay. What was your sense of this Kanye West and Fuentes meeting with the former president of the United States, and then the president being unwilling to say, by the way, what they stand for, I abhor? Mm-hmm. Did it deserve the kind of attention it got when Jonathan Tobin says, this is the end? No Jew, no American Jew should ever support Trump again because he met with these men and then did not condemn their anti-Semitism. Did he go too far? Did you feel it was totally appropriate? And when you heard about it yourself, Laura, what was your reaction?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I want to answer it and touch on some of the things that you just brought up. I wrote an article for The Forward, I believe it was entitled, "I Listened to Kanye West Slander the Jews for 3 hours so that you don't have to," public service journalism. And in many ways, he was not saying anything new. What is alarming to me about the situation is not even the extent to which it's been covered, but the fact that in 2022, a major celebrity is espousing virulent anti-Semitism and certainly facing consequences, certainly getting pushback. But it is a miracle that for several decades in American public discourse, you didn't see so much of that outside of isolated incidents. I do think that the media attention economy is really complicated. Every day in the newsroom, we ask ourselves whether covering something is giving outsized weight to it. Look, Jonathan Tobin's piece was, I think, brave and important, but I say often it's not brave to call out anti-Semitism across the aisle as much as it is within your own camp. So I think it was very brave for Tobin to do so. I did not vote for Trump. I thought the line should have been drawn when he came down the escalator saying that Mexicans were sending rapists and not their best people. The line for me was drawn a long time ago. But I do want to touch on this fact that is accurate, that we have often seen an outsized attention or a simplification of the narrative on anti-Semitism that says, you know, every incident in the United States is committed by a white nationalist. The asterisk on that is every incident that you can tie back to someone with extremist affiliations, the vast majority of those for the last several years have been perpetrated by white nationalists. But most anti-Semitism is not ideological in the sense that the person is espousing a belief like white or black supremacy. It, as I wrote after an incident that was not brought up in your intro, but that I think was very important, the January 15th hostage situation at Congregation Beth Israel in Colleyville, Texas. Thank God it was averted. The perpetrator of that attack was not a white man. He was a Pakistani nationalist. It was very unclear from his online behavior what extremist identities he held, but certainly plenty of them. Most anti-Semitism does not fit the way that we think about hate, which I wrote after the Colleyville attack for the Washington Post about how it's basically a conspiracy theory of Jews holding outsized power. So there was a piece by Mitchell Silber in the New York Times. He now works with the Jewish community and security issues, but he was with the NYPD for a long time. And when he was looking at the data in 2019, and it's still similar today, a third of the attackers in the physical assaults on Jews had a history of mental illness, and 2/3 were local youth. That's not a problem that you can easily map back to these major ideologies. And I think also, we were speaking earlier of Black-Jewish relations. Just two short things I'll say on that. One, as Black Jews point out to me all the time, they feel erased in that conversation that pits it as two wholly separate communities. There certainly is overlap. But I would say number two, just as the Jewish community has incredible diversity, so too does the Black American community. So certain areas have better relationships than others, but it's certainly more nuanced than we can just sum up in a sentence.
Eric, do you respond to anything either Steve or Laura has said?
If you're going to ask me what disturbs me the most, it's the normalization of anti-Semitism in the public square, in the public forum. It's all over the media in a way that simply wasn't the case before. And I'm not talking about individuals now in social media, but here I am mostly concerned about the far right, the extremist right, the white supremacist right, Trump, and so on, because those are the people who really command attention on the media. And if you look at Kanye West, and if you look at Donald Trump, if you look at Kyrie Irving, just over the course of the last 2 months, and the number of stories and the amount of coverage and the number of hits and so on, That goes way beyond anything that we have seen in recent history. And that scares me to death, because everybody sees this. And all the various groups that Steve and Laura have talked about are going to be, unfortunately, inspired and incited by this kind of public discussion. We had a pause after the Holocaust. We had a pause.
Very long pause.
A very long pause. And that pause now seems to be over. Mm-hmm. And while we have to fight it in every place, we certainly have to try and get it out of a normalized, accepted part of public discussion in America. Because if that happens, we're in serious trouble.
So in 2022, and as we begin 2023, David, are you frightened of what might come out of this more normalized anti-Semitism that Eric and Laura are speaking about? Or do you feel somewhat different?
Definitely not frightened. I don't see that frightened is a helpful response to a situation like this. We want to be clear-eyed, we want to be prepared, we want to be constructive, we want to be practical, and we want to be proud and forthright and take initiative in responding to the challenges that we face. And I don't think we have any dispute in terms of how serious these challenges are. The question for all of us has to be, how do we respond? And what is different now to how it has been? Because again, we can say that it hasn't been this bad since pre-Holocaust, but there are very significant differences. And if we're not clear-eyed about what those differences are, and we're not focused on taking advantages of the tools that we have at our fingertips and the big differences, then we're ceding ground in this great battleground of ideas.
Okay, Eric, I watched what happened when Kyrie Irving was just an idiot. And then when the Mar-a-Lago dinner was held with Kanye West talking about death on 3 to the Jews, what I saw was public ridicule. I didn't see on any network, I didn't see in any major paper, I didn't see on any major publication anybody saying, when Laura says Jonathan Tobin was courageous, no one said, Kanye West, that was a courageous thing he said. No one said, Kyrie Irving, good for you. Basically, the question was, for a moment, was Kyrie Irving ever going to play again in the NBA? And again, my own sense is, while I understand I don't dispute the fact that there is a greater sense of anti-Semitism today than you and I ever dreamed would be a reality. And it's not just that there was a pause after the Holocaust. We all thought everybody had learned their lesson, and that it wasn't going to be, certainly in Eastern Europe, it wasn't going to be true. In Western Europe, it was not going to be true. And in America, there would be no anti-Semitism. And it was peaceful for a while, and it's less so. But what I don't see is any American, for example, or for that matter, and here I may not know enough, but I know there's no, within America, any large sense of good for you, Kanye West.
One example, and then I'll stop. When Kanye West began on his tirades, the Republican members of the Judiciary Committee in the House put up a tweet, and it said, Kanye, Trump, Elon. That tweet, there was a bit of an uproar, remained on the site for 55 days. So a man who'd won 21 Grammy Awards, was arguably the most famous entertainer in the world, was at that time a billionaire, and who had been ranting about the Jews, appeared on a tweet put up by a significant Republican committee in the House of Representatives, and it remained up for 55 days.
You know, I want to add, sorry, to what you were saying. You know, one of the, I guess, positive side effects to this outburst was that you had every single one of the Kardashian clan expressing solidarity with the Jewish people in response to Kanye. And their combined following is 500 to 1,000% what Kanye's following is. So without minimizing the threat that we face, I think it's also important to be clear-eyed about those opportunities. It's a battleground. It's a battlefield that we are engaging on a day-to-day basis. And we have great resources that we can muster at our disposal. And that's the challenge for us today.
Two observations here. Number one, we should not forget, in terms of this long pause, I'd say it was very long, really, as late as 1999, Commentary magazine, which is hardly soft on anti-Semitism, they ran an article saying any anti-Semitism that exists is simply a matter of a time lag. In other words, it's something that simply hasn't died as yet, and presumably it will over time. So in that respect, the pause was very, very long. During that pause, American history became one of no society in diaspora Jewish history could ever rival America in terms of its acceptability of Jews, in terms of its welcoming of Jewish participation. That's something we should not lose sight of. And frequently I find discussions about anti-Semitism focus on the negative without realizing what the place of Jews is in American society. We are still the most esteemed of all groupings. So in that respect, one word of context here is that the ship is far from sinking, if you will. Number two, American Jewry today is in a far better place, politically at least, than it ever was in the pre-Holocaust era. Number one, American Jews have a great deal of political influence. Number two, America itself is a far more pluralistic society than it was in the isolationist 1930s. So in that respect, when I say I'm not frightened, I'm concerned because there's definitely been a spike in anti-Semitism. The spike is wrong morally, and it should be disturbing to anyone who is concerned with these issues and concerned about the position of Jews in American society. But where it stands in terms of the overall course of American Jewish history, it's a long pause that has come to an end. We should be concerned, but it's hardly been a complete turnaround. Jews still occupy a position where all positions are open to Jewish participation, to Jewish influence. I venture to predict in my lifetime, which may not have all that many more years ahead, we will see a Jewish president. Exactly who that would be, I can't say, but the trend is moving in that direction. It's very healthy that America has become so open to minority participation, and that's quite unique in terms of world history.
And you know, I would add that that state of affairs is because of the First Amendment and not despite it.
That's fair. I would add one other comment, and that goes back though to Eric's comments about normalization. I'm not comfortable with lumping Trump in with what might be called hardcore anti-Semites. I don't see that, and I'm hardly his greatest fan. If anything, a couple years ago we had a debate here as to whether he should be considered for Jewish Person of the Year, and I vigorously opposed it, as I recall.
I remember.
Okay. That said, what Trump has done, is to say there are good people on both sides, to put it into Charlottesville language, meaning that he himself, my best friends are Jewish, my grandchildren are Jewish, I've always had Jewish business associates. Don't tar me with the brush of anti-Semitism. However, what you can and should tar him with is that he's given a platform, he's legitimated some of the most extreme voices in American society. That is abandoning his responsibility as a public figure. It's one of the reasons I'm convinced he's one of the worst president we've ever had. I don't understand why Orthodox Jews support, I do understand it, but I don't approve of Orthodox Jews supporting him because I think they're supporting someone who stands for everything that Orthodoxy is against. That said, I don't think it's fair to tar him with the brush of anti-Semitism. What is of concern, does he legitimate the anti-Semitism that exists elsewhere in American circles?
Okay, again, I want to push it forward a little bit. As I look at the things that were mentioned in my open, of all the things that happened this year, what is the most significant It's the results of this fifth round of elections, where the makeup of both the Knesset and the makeup of the ministries appear to be going in a direction that many people would have said is not in consonance with what the Israeli people stand for and what the state of Israel stands for. And in terms of world Jewry and this notion of we are one, it is hard to say that if in Israel there are things that shut down the interaction between diaspora Jewry and the state of Israel, and most specifically, American Jewry. So for me, while everything I mentioned is of some importance, I'm suggesting that the one that is the most important is what is likely to come out of this election. And I also have taken the position on JBS that Israel is more than an idea. Israel is living human beings. Israel is our family, and this Jewish ethic, every Jew is responsible for every other Jew, has been at the essence of why Jews have survived so well. We care enormously for other Jews, and out of that, the Jewish tradition teaches we are to treat non-Jews in a similar fashion. But it begins with one's own family. And for me, I cannot imagine ever being in a position where I would say what Abe Foxman said, that if Israel does X, Y, and Z, whatever it is, I will no longer support the state of Israel. And I am critical of rabbis in America who suggest to their congregation that unless Israel changes, their political support and their financial support should be withheld from the Jewish state. And so for me, the issue is, and I thought you wrote a brilliant piece in Aretz where you describe who the people are and what they represent. It is not clear to me that they will do what they say they will do once they're in office. Very often, politicians say all kinds of things before they're in office, and when they're in office, they moderate. And this was a democratic election, and you point out they only won 11% of the vote, the hard right and the extremists. But 11% in a coalition situation is enough to buy oneself a great deal of power, and we have bemoaned here in America for generations the extent to which small Orthodox parties have wielded a disproportionate amount of influence because they were needed for a coalition government. And that's, by the way, that's the reality of Israel. The reality of Israel is it is a parliamentary government. And a parliamentary government is almost by definition going to be a coalition government. There's no party that's ever gotten more than 60 seats on its own, and therefore there's always a coalition. What is upsetting to Abe Foxman and to Eric Yoffie is that it looks like people who once, and I forget how you said this, who once would have been thought to be beyond the pale by Israel in general, suddenly are in the pale. And suddenly they are part of the government. They are elected to the government. It was done also, as you point out in your piece. Bibi Netanyahu did it all himself by getting these small parties to coalesce into one party, because on their own they were not likely to get past the threshold of the percentage of votes they would need to win to become members of the Knesset. But by joining together as a group, they did pass the threshold. And what you're now saying, and you say this in your piece, now that they're elected, Bibi can't ignore them. And because Bibi can't ignore them, each one of them is saying, I want this position, I want this ministerial position. And, the three you mentioned all have been given, at the moment, tentative, very important positions in a government. And at the same time, I cannot go anywhere near as far as Abe Foxman goes. And by the way, I want to make sure this is said on JBS. Abe Foxman is a very dear friend of mine, and I have a social relationship with him. And I think very highly of him. And the fact that I disagree with him on this in no way minimizes how much I love him and his wife, and they have been wonderful to me. Anyway, I find it, however, I don't want to hear Rick Jacobs, head of the URJ now, the position Eric once held. I don't want to hear Rick Jacobs talk about whether millionaires should withhold their money from the state of Israel because Israel has done X, Y, or Z. I don't want to hear anybody say Jews should not support the state of Israel, even if we go through a hard period. And my own sense also is history just keeps moving on. And I believe if the right wing or the nationalists, and by nationalists you mean those who believe in an expanding Jewish presence on the West Bank, if they exert an influence which the Israeli people overwhelmingly disapprove of, then ultimately that coalition government will fall, and there'll be another round of elections, and there'll be another attempt. What I don't think you wrote about, and then I will be quiet and let you all talk. What I don't think you wrote about was the extent to which the vote for right-wing nationalist groups of parties was motivated in part by a horrific year, 2022, of Arab violence against Jews, specifically Arab Israelis, where that had been quiet for quite some time, as well as Palestinians on the West Bank. And that in the state of Israel, there is a hunger for law and order. There's a hunger for those who say, we must clamp down and we must protect, as opposed to those who say, if a Jew defends himself and ends up killing an Arab or a Palestinian, that Jew is a terrorist. There is a difference between what a terrorist is and what someone who is defending himself against terrorism is. I think the Israeli people, and this has been written about by many, the Israeli people needed at this moment in time they needed people who they feel were going to take a harder stand. One of the reasons why Netanyahu won, and there were many, many people in Israel who really want him gone and who feel, enough's enough already. And yet, lo and behold, he wins again. All right. So that's my reaction. I really feel this still becomes the most significant event in the year 2022. And Eric, since you did write the column, you get to react any way you want first to what extent would you agree with me that it is the most important event? And whether you do or do not, how do you view it now?
All right, I'll respond very briefly. Obviously, the conclusion of my piece is that without Israel, we are a truncated, incomplete people.
Yes, you make that absolutely. And you do not go as far as
No,
Abe Foxman.
I love Abe Foxman. He's just contributed a great deal to American Jewish life. For me, support for Israel is never conditional. It will never be conditional. It's unconditional. It's not uncritical, but it's unconditional. But look, I'm simply going to say, I do think that a Kahanist Israel will not survive. That as an objective fact, it cannot survive. It's inconsistent with Jewish tradition and history, and it's not taking into account the challenges Israel faces in the world. I think Kahanism has reared its ugly head in this election. It concerns me a great deal. But I am reasonably optimistic, as you are, that it can be overcome. I think it's going to take a tremendous amount of effort, mostly on the part of the citizens of Israel, but with the help and support of diaspora Jews as well, because Israel is the state of the Jewish people, and as committed Jews, we have every right to participate in this battle. So I'll turn it over to others, but I believe that we can find a way to defeat the Kahanists, recognizing Israel's a right-wing country now. I mean, as you've indicated. There's no way you can read the election as anything other than a triumph for the right wing, but there's a difference between being a right-wing country and a Kahanist country. Israel can't be a Kahanist country, and I don't think that ultimately it will be.
Yeah, and just for anybody who might not understand what you mean, what does it mean to be a Kahanist country as opposed to a right-wing country?
Look, Meir Kahane was a racist, and he came up with a series of laws that put the Arab population of Israel in a subordinate legal status. There would be separate beaches, for example, for Arabs and Jews, because the Arabs were not full. Also, they were to be denied full citizenship. He at least flirted with the idea of forcible transfer of the Arabs out of the country, and to the extent that he didn't quite go there, he unquestionably gave them a subordinate place in Israeli society, including those who are now full citizens of Israel. So when we're talking about Kahanism, that's what we're talking about.
And you're worried that somebody like Gvir, who is a disciple of Kahane.
He's an acknowledged disciple of Kahane. He says, well, he's more moderate now.
That's right. He says he's changed.
He says he's changed, but I ask the question, if somebody has had a picture of a Jewish mass murderer, as you said, Baruch Goldstein, in his living room for years and years and years, as a man that he adored, according to his own acknowledgement, should such a man be the minister of police in the state of Israel? And my view is no. I don't care how moderate he says he has become.
Okay.
Let me begin with this issue of Israel as a right-wing country. I probably would put a little bit more modestly right-leaning rather than necessarily right-wing. It's been headed in that direction not since Bibi Netanyahu, but actually as far back as 1967. So in that respect, it's only the culmination or one further step in a road that Israel has been going through. Partly for the reasons you mentioned, namely the disappointment with Oslo, the failure of any kind of peace process, the sense that the Arabs are never willing to accept Israel. That said, American Jewry has a problem with Israel drifting down that road because American Jewry, left to its own inclinations, is center-leaning left. That's not going to change, and in that respect, Danny Gordis, I think, put it very well in the title of his last book, We Stand Divided, that there is a real gulf between American Jewry and Israel, and the challenge to American Jewish leaders, like Abe Foxman, who I also respect very greatly, is can they live with an Israel that's becoming increasingly religious, increasingly right-wing? Whether it's the symbol of Kahanism is particularly jarring, but it's a larger trend in which Israel's been going down this road. And my reaction would be very similar to Eric, namely that Israel has so transformed the Jewish world for the better. It's the success story of modern Jewish history, that our allegiances to it should transcend particular governments. And if there's anything positive to learn from the Donald Trump experience, is that we went through a ton of things here in this country for 4 years. I was nauseated God knows how many times. Never once did I think of myself as distant from America. So in that respect, that may be the saving grace there. I think there's a second point, though, and that is that when American Jewish leaders do face the issue of distancing from Israel, you need to put the emphasis on where it belongs, that it's not about particular policies. What it's about is assimilation. In other words, the more distant you are from matters Jewish generally, the more distant you're going to be from Israel. One of the reasons that we have such a tough time talking about Israel is that, yes, its values represent traditionalist values that American Jews simply feel uncomfortable with, and that's part of their distancing from traditional Jewish values. That said, what does frighten me about this new government, it's the most right-wing government, or the prospect, the most right-wing government we've ever known, is that every cabinet minister, whether it's an Avi Maoz, who has a relatively minor post, or someone like Bezalel Smotrich, who has real power, that minister has a bully pulpit. In other words, he will stand for certain things, and he will have a microphone, if you will, to broadcast those things. That is damaging to Israel internally, that it sends the message that these kinds of ideas regarded as extreme and far out suddenly become much more mainstream. Secondly, it's damaging, in other words, it damages the very fabric, the very glue holding Israeli society together. Tel Aviv, if you will, becomes much more of a bubble, and the West Bank, if you will, becomes much more of the mainstream. The West Bank settlers, for example, the proposal to legitimize the hilltop youth settlements, which have always been regarded as illegal. Why the government has not removed them is a good question, but they've always been regarded as illegal. Secondly, it does damage the image of Israel abroad, and obviously particularly here in the United States. One of the things, again, to learn from the Trump experience is that his spokespersons during the last election kept on saying, watch what we do, not what we say. Israeli spokesmen, including the prime minister, is saying exactly that right now, or the would-be prime minister. Well, what we say makes a world of difference. The rhetoric coming out of Trump was polarizing. The rhetoric coming out of the likes of ben-gvir, Smotrich, and Maoz will be deeply damaging to how Israelis perceive themselves and how Jews abroad perceive the state of Israel.
What will happen next then? If you're right, and if it will do damage, what's going to be the result of that damage?
Personally, I'm fairly sanguine that legislative change will not take place.
Okay.
That does not mean the rhetorical change will not take place. The educational message. Someone like Maoz is a very dangerous person because he's speaking a language that many Israelis hear and say, how about a halachic state? And to some extent, that's what Jews have prayed for millennia. He's brought that from the fringes into the mainstream. So what I foresee is that we're not going to see terribly much different in terms of legislation. When the Prime Minister says the religious status quo will maintain itself, I hope we'll keep those promises. I have questions about annexing settlements, which is one of the things that might be below the surface at present. But no, I don't foresee a halakhic state. What I do foresee is more people talking about extremist measures. I think Eric and his colleagues would be perfectly in line, order, and protesting any attempt to change the law of return, which has been, again, it's been part of a bedrock piece of legislation. It's under attack by the likes of Smotrich and Maoz.
That's the kind of thing. The suggestion is that conversions to them by non-Orthodox rabbis will not be accepted for the law of return.
And the chief rabbinate has wanted a monopoly over all conversions from day one, from 1948. They regard it as a mistake. They never had that monopoly. From Bibi's perspective, this is something his coalition demands. I wouldn't be surprised if it were advanced. It's already a piece of legislation being proposed as we speak. So we will see some legislative changes. We'll probably nowhere near as vast as some of the spokespersons are talking about. But the main change I see is a rhetorical change. Change the law of return, I don't think too many Jews will be physically affected. That the image of Reform Judaism, in the state of Israel, will be damaged, and that Reform Jews will be aghast at that I do credit. Yeah.
Laura?
First of all, I think I was just at it's called the Z3 conference in Palo Alto, talking about this relationship between Israeli Jews and American Jews, and Matan Kahane, who has been, he had to get security guards because he's an Orthodox Jew, but he was very much pushing for the rabbinate not to have total control over things like conversion. And he said, and it's my experience as well, most Israeli Jews have actually not met Reform Jews. Like, Reform Judaism is not really the way that Israeli Jews experience the world. And that gets to the thing that really worries me. I'm, of course, worried about the extent to which the incoming government is going to roll back civil rights for both Israelis and Palestinians. But the bigger thing that worries me is that the American Jewish world is not prepared for the reality among people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. You see in Israel the trend line, because just given the birth rates, the share of right-wing Jews is growing in Israel. We're seeing the opposite trend happen in the United States. Younger people are increasingly liberal or progressive. And whereas Jews alive today in their 50s and 60s and older probably have pretty similar views on Israel, whether you look at an Israeli Jew or an American Jew, that's just absolutely not the case for people in their 20s and 30s and 40s. We saw in the most recent Pew study of American Jews, young Jews are increasingly secular. Young Jews increasingly still care about Israel very deeply, but increasingly find the fact that since many of us were in elementary school, there has been an occupation, very hard to square with our Jewish values. That reality we're not prepared to deal with. I certainly am someone that does not believe in conditioning government aid to Israel, but the only relationship that's unconditional is between God and man. No human relationship is truly unconditional, and I think for other Jews in my peer group, it's going to become increasingly difficult to justify the things that Israel is doing that do not align with their values. Michael Koplow wrote a column for us in the foreword explaining how this election is going to make it more difficult for people who do advocate on behalf of Israel to make the case that there are shared values when, again, you see ministers who praise convicted terrorists when, I mean, by the time this airs, it'll probably be decided, but it's really up in the air what control of the West Bank is going to look like in this next government. These hilltop settlements may actually become legalized, and control may actually go from, being in control of more centrist figures to more hardliners within the West Bank. So I don't have an answer, but we really have to grapple with this fact that we have this shared relationship, if we're talking about people in their 40s and 50s and older. Among younger Jews, the gulf is only growing.
Okay, there are many ways in which our view of the world is very similar. I am not, however, I don't sit exactly where you sit. And I don't see one thing Israel does that I say to myself, that's a violation of Jewish values. I don't see one thing it's done. What I do see is a plethora of things Israel does that is only in keeping with Jewish values and which make me very, very proud. Do I think Israel makes mistakes? Like any country, yes. But the mistakes Israel makes are in a context which I understand, and I think overall the Israeli people and Netanyahu as well, and all of them have in their mind, all we'd like to do is create a just society where there's peace between us and everyone, and we keep offering. And sadly, the leadership, not necessarily the Palestinian who lives in a specific Arab Israeli town or a Palestinian town, but in general, the leadership has rejected any attempt to make peace because they are convinced Israel is, in essence, a violation of their sacred right to the land from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. And as long as that's true, there isn't anything Israel can do or say that will make a difference. And that's a tragedy. because I know the Israeli people have before, and I believe they would do it in a heartbeat today, if there were an honest interlocutor who would want to make peace with them. What do you say about this whole topic?
Well, I think, you recognize at the beginning that politics in Israel is very different to politics here. Because of the political system, it is very conducive to, let's just say, political disfiguration. And it's not the first time. The last government, frankly, had extremists in it as well. And that upset a lot of people. I think what's happened over here, interestingly, in terms of just understanding the dynamics of this election, it's often framed as sort of a sharp jolt to the right. The truth is that Israeli politics, as you pointed out, has been politically stable for quite a long time. When I say stable, I mean more or less in the same place. You have a segment that are sort of Likudniks. I mean, in all the time that Bibi has run for office, the amount of seats that he's held have varied slightly,
Yes.
2, 3, 4, 5,
Absolutely.
but not massively, marginally, right? And then you have a segment to the right of Bibi. So there are a lot of Israelis, let's say it's 10 or 11%, and their view of how they vote is going to be something along these lines. They're going to say, I want a right-wing government, but I want to keep Bibi honest. So as long as there's a right-wing government, I'm going to vote to the right of Bibi. And in the past, those votes would go for Bennett, they'd go for Ayelet Shaked, they'd go for Avigdor Lieberman, right? But with those parties sort of aligning themselves in the anti-Bibi camp, what you have is the breakdown from right to left became a breakdown between pro-Bibi and anti-Bibi on the right itself. And in this particular election, there was, because those other parties had deserted Bibi in terms of political allegiances, there was only one option left to the right of Bibi. And these fellows, people like Itamar ben-gvir, who never crossed the threshold before, it's not that he suddenly became a superstar, but he was wrapped into this only option that exists to the right of Bibi. And after what the electorate faced last time, where a lot of right-wing voters felt like they were betrayed, they felt that it was important to sort of keep this right of Bibi pillar in place and voted for the only option. But this was a real victory for Bibi, and Bibi understands this. And I think because of that, whatever you're seeing now in the midst of negotiations, this is sort of the high point of the influence of these parties. It's the high point because they've got to get this election done. Bibi knows how to manage his partners. It's been the source of frustration for all the different political allegiances he's had. It's why they're trying to pre-negotiate legislative outcomes now, because they know that Bibi has a way of managing his partners. At the end of the day, it's a Likud government that's leading on a Likud platform. And while they have an opportunity now to try and negotiate some terms, they're not running the show. They're not running the show. And there are other parties that the Prime Minister will look to keep in touch with. And if some of his coalition partners he feels get out of hand and are not in line with the values that he holds, he'll be looking to keep other doors open as well. So I wouldn't prejudge. I think we have time to see how this unfolds. And historically, it's not the first time that we've dealt with something like this before. I mean, when Begin was voted in, they said he was a terrorist. Sharon was a murderer. And things sort of turned out quite differently. So let's see. I do believe in salvation for everyone.
Okay, fair enough. So I thought of one topic that I missed. We saw this year the closing of one of the historic main pillars of American Jewish life. We saw HUC in Cincinnati close. HUC in Cincinnati was the home, the wellspring of Reform Judaism. Isaac Mayer Wise, blah, blah, blah. And whether, you were a student at HUC in Cincinnati or JR in New York, or you went to Los Angeles, everybody understood that the hub of Reform Jewish life came out of the Midwest, and more so HUC. And HUC closed down because there aren't enough young people interested in becoming Reform rabbis. Just bottom line, what's it say to you that HUC shut down and is JTS next? And what's happening to American Judaism if HUC has to shut down?
Well, first of all, it is it's a loss in terms of historical memory and tradition. So in that respect, I felt very badly about it. The sense of part of the uniqueness of HUC was that it did have a campus right there in the Midwest, as opposed to New York and Los Angeles and Jerusalem, or in conjunction with those three other ones. So the sense of loss is quite real. I visited there numerous times. I lectured there. So I felt a sense of a great chapter in American Jewish history has been terminated.
Yes.
And that I felt terrible about. In terms of what's happening in the broader scale, look, you can't get away from the findings of Pew. The findings of Pew is that my kids used to tell me the definition of an adult is someone who has stopped growing at both ends and is growing around the middle. American Jewry is experiencing the exact opposite. It's growing at both ends among the Orthodox and among the unaffiliated. The two major movements, conservative and Reform Judaism, more conservative than Reform, have suffered significant losses, significant erosion. Reform has held its own primarily because it's become the welcoming address for mixed marrieds, which increasingly is becoming normative in American Jewish life, which again is a cause of considerable concern. But that may be only a temporary mechanism of holding on for a while. So in that respect, what's happening is that, the ends are growing, the middle is declining. With the decline of the middle goes the decline of the spirit of moderation. A sense perhaps on the part of those who would say that, yes, I have criticisms of Israel, people like yourself, but there's no questioning my allegiances. So in that sense, the decline of the middle is an enormous tragedy for the American Jewish community.
Eric, what does it mean to you? HUC in Cincinnati is no longer there.
Look, on the one hand, it's a very practical issue. The Hebrew Union College had 4 campuses, 4 major plants. That wasn't sustainable. We've known for 30 years it wasn't sustainable. Institutional inertia takes some time and prevented us from moving more quickly on that. Secondly, look, there's a demographic shift also been going on for some time. The Midwest was the heart of the Reform movement in the early days, in the 19th century. That was a positive thing. And the Hebrew Union College existed in Cincinnati in order to serve that Midwestern core of Reform Jews. Now, as we know, Jews have migrated. Of course, they migrated to the coast, they're migrating to the south. If you look at the great Midwestern community, I mean, there are still some sources of strength in Chicago, for example, but a lot of those smaller communities that existed in many cases for a century have now finally either disappeared or almost disappeared. And finally, a big question to which I have no answers is, what's happening to rabbis? Look, there are those who say that we're moving away from a rabbinic-dominated Judaism, and there'll be more secular leaders and more lay leaders. I'm very skeptical about that, perhaps because I'm a rabbi, I acknowledge. I believe that looking at Jewish history, in the absence of rabbis, Jewish communities don't survive. And the overall number of applicants to non-Orthodox rabbinical schools, although I'm not so sure about the Orthodox ones either, is down. And that's something that troubles me. Now, to some extent, what we have is alternative schools. So you have to take that into account. You have the Boston Hebrew College, and you have the Academy of Jewish Religion, which has been kind of revived and is doing better. So there are some signs of hope there. The diversity and the pluralism in that realm, those are good things. Nonetheless, if you look at the numbers now as compared to, say, 40 years ago, they aren't what they should be, and that troubles me. Unless we're going to have a stream of young rabbis, men and women, diverse in belief and practice, coming out of our rabbinical schools, then it's hard to see how we're going to have a vibrant community. So that's where I see cause for concern.
You said very well. And you know, again, you and I did not go to Cincinnati, and I have no emotional tie to it. And yet, I was very saddened when I heard it was closing. And I am also very upset that it is exactly because of what you just said. There are not enough young people who want to be, in this instance, Reform rabbis, or maybe rabbis in general. And I agree with you. The rabbi remains, you know, and not every rabbi is wonderful. Doesn't matter. The rabbi remains a critical part of Jewish leadership and Jewish learning and Jewish teaching. There was a library at HUC in Cincinnati that was one of the great libraries in the Jewish world. I don't know that it's been shut down.
No, the library
No, the library
open.
and the archives are untouched.
Okay, well that's good, because that would be critical. Anyway, I just wanted to mention this as part of our year in review. All right, so we're almost done. Do you have a Jewish person of the year, David?
I got to go with Bibi.
Bibi. Eric,
Aleph Bet Yehoshua,
why?
because he is the model of what a public Jewish intellectual should be. He died in the middle of the year, but his whole life was an example of what a smart, talented, intellectual, committed person could do, not only in his own field of literature, but in the public square. We have very few Jewish public intellectuals who are effective and impressive and make a difference. He was one, and I mean, I could give you the reasons if you want them.
Lovely.
I should explain why Bibi while we're at it, okay? Because it's not on the grounds that we've just discussed, you know, his 9 political lives and all of that. But I think his greatest contribution, and, you know, one that he's poised to continue, is that he, more than anyone else, any other Jewish leader in the last half century, or certainly Israeli political leader, has brought the Jewish state and together the Jewish people into the community of nations as an equal, as a partner, as an entity that can relate on the basis of interests and establish, you know, long-term relationships on that basis. You know, for a long time it was ideological and it was moral, and we want it to continue to be that way for a very, very long time. But we know how geopolitics works. You know, we have a state today that can stand shoulder to shoulder with the biggest and the best actors on the global stage. And that happened under his tenure and under his direction. And for decades and centuries to come, I think that'll be the greatest contribution that he should and could be recognized for.
Beautifully said. Laura?
I'm going with a pair which were involved in the same incident, and that's Rabbi Charlie Citron Walker of Congregation Beth Israel and Rabbi Angela Buckdahl of the Central Synagogue, who together provided us with a very frightening look at both the power of our values and of our haters. And they successfully were able to, through the course of almost an entire day, diffuse a terrorist attack on a synagogue that could have very easily been deadly. I think that the fact that Rabbi Walker opened the door with kindness to a stranger who looked like he needed help or space or just a warm cup of tea is the exemplification of Jewish values. The fact that the people that were stuck inside the synagogue were able to remember the security training they'd received from the Jewish community and use that to save Jewish lives, and it is an exemplification of our values. And the fact that the very next week, Rabbi Walker was back in synagogue, Rabbi Buckdahl was back in her synagogue leading vibrant congregations is a sign of our resilience.
Very impressive. You moved me. Okay, who you got?
First of all, as far as Bibi Netanyahu is concerned, I'd like to see how he does in this forthcoming tenure. Right now, someone standing under indictment, serious indictments, I have a lot of trouble with.
Okay, by the way, are you going to talk about this for a second? Because if you are,
Yeah.
I just want to throw in, we happen to have picked the same person. And, you know, I know Yehoshua from things he did with JBS. I don't know him much more outside of that, but he was a very, very impressive person. And when I hear you talk about him, it reminds me more about him, and it makes me feel good. And I'm glad he lived as long as he did, because he had an extra long time to have an impact, and he used that time very, very well. When I hear what you say, I happen to think that Angela Buchdahl right now is the single best pulpit rabbi in America, an effective leader in the Jewish world, and she is an example of what you would want a rabbi to be in many, many ways. Now, having said that, my person of the year is Benjamin Netanyahu, a personality and a presence in the Jewish world. He transcends the state of Israel. He has, the fact that he has 9 lives politically, he gets credit for that too. Okay, now in that context, the two of us have named Bibi. You say what?
Well, first, I want to say amen to your comments were Rabbi Buchdahl, which are beautifully put. I've known her since she was she applied for a Wexner Fellowship way back in 1990s. It's fair to say that she dazzled the Wexner Committee, myself included. As far as Aleph Ben Yehoshua is concerned, I had him twice for major gatherings at the American Jewish Committee. It's also fair to say that he completely dissed American Jewry, diaspora Jewry generally. You know, he took the very triumphalist view that there will always be Israel, and in the diaspora, you'll still be, thinking about being, saying next year in the moon rather than next year in Jerusalem, or better yet, say next year in Jerusalem, we really have a better chance of being in the moon at that point. So, in that sense, I have trouble with Orthodox Jews who dismiss non-Orthodox Jews. I have trouble with Israelis who dismiss the diaspora.
Yehoshua made the case for Zionism better than anybody I know. And he did it his whole life. He wrote this book that I read as a young rabbi called B'Zechut HaNormaliyut, in praise of being normal, in which he made the case that for Judaism to survive and to thrive and to be a creative force, you had to live in a majority Jewish society. And it was a brilliant case. And with all that I read about Zionism, when I read that as a young rabbi, it really opened my eyes, and it turned me into a committed Zionist. Now, from that, he drew 2 conclusions. One, initially, he said, well, we have to have 2 states, because if we're going to have a Jewish majority in Israel, then that's the only way that we can do that. And his second was, if Jewish majority is essential for creative Jewish living, then if you live there, you're going to be better off than if you live somewhere else where you're not a majority. And as he traveled around the diaspora, he would make this case. I heard it from him as a young man. He would go into a diaspora community, and he would say, Israel is the place you need to be if you want to be a serious Jew. He would make the argument. People would get very upset, and then he would move along. And then 10 years later, you do it again, and 10 years later, he would do it again. Why was he important? He was important, first of all, because he knew how to make a civil argument. He knew how to make a civil argument. And he was thoughtful, and he was knowledgeable, and he argued from the Jewish tradition. He was a secular Jew, argued against Judaism, but knew something about Judaism. And in that sense, I appeared with him once in Jerusalem, where we had this debate. It was one of the most important incidents in my life, but I was dazzled by him, even though I disagreed with him. I disagreed with him on all, and he was also able to change his mind. Towards the end of his life, he came out against 2 states. He said it was no longer possible. And that was an extraordinary step for him to make, and gave the arguments, didn't convince me. I disagreed with him on a number of major points, but nobody really, who else was able in our world to sustain for 40 years an ongoing discussion on what Zionism is really about and the issues at the heart of Zionism in the way that Aleph Bet Yehoshua was. And I suggest nobody. And among a certain portion of our community, the intellectual and literary part, he was a hugely important man.
Persuasive case in many ways. I do have a candidate I want to put on the table, but let me just respond to the two of you in terms of Bibi. The record, and it's a very long record, is what you say. He did restore, if you will, Israel's place among the nations as a nation state. And I certainly would be the first to give him credit for that. The issue at the same time, to me, is that he's been a very divisive figure, both here and in Israel. There are those who love him without question. There are others who say, listen, he's the one who did kill the two-state solution. In other words, that first he came out by saying his famous Bar Ilan speech, in which he said, he's in favor of a two-state solution, and then he retreated from it. He campaigned on a promise to annex the settlements. He didn't fulfill the promise because Trump and Jared Kushner basically took it out from him. They saved him from doing so. What he'll do in his next term, I don't know. I prefer to reserve judgment, but certainly I have a hard time supporting him as a person of the year when he stands under indictment, number one, and number two, when he's right now surrounding himself with a rather narrow base of constituency. My own nominee has not been mentioned. I want to put him on the table, and that's the President Zelensky of Ukraine. Here he is standing up for what Jews should be standing up for, namely resistance of tyranny. He's in many ways fighting the battle on behalf of all of Western civilization. Namely that you have this person in power in Russia who clearly is trying to restore the old Soviet empire. Resisting that is something that Czechoslovakia did not do, Poland did not do, Hungary did not do. Hungary did in theory, but certainly not with any degree of success. The fact that he sustained it, to me, is remarkable. He does so proudly as a Jew, and in that sense, I have enormous admiration for him and would say that he's certainly among world leaders. He is a Jewishly committed, Jewishly identified individual who is fighting the good fight.
He has also done more and more repressive things in Ukraine, where he has limited free speech, is putting opposition people in jail, and in many ways he is not representing what either the United States of America in its best, because who knows what we do.
Look what Roosevelt did during World War II.
Yeah.
Look what Lincoln did during the Civil War.
Anyway, I don't think Zelensky should get a pass, and he's in a very difficult situation. But you make it sound black and white, or white, and it's not my understanding of the reality. And I don't know if any of the three of you have any sense of who Zelensky is today. But again, as I understand what it looks like, but when I understand what's more, who is suffering, it's not clear to me that we should make him into what you just made him, or that he deserves to be Person of the Year.
I would push back on that a bit, if I may, and then I would love to hear from you as well. Ukraine is an incredibly young democracy, and if you look at where the United States or Israel was at that point in its history, it was still in the battle for survival, and in many ways the battle in Ukraine, I'm not saying this to exaggerate, it's a battle for the soul of the world. Do we believe in self-determination and self-governance and freedom of information of individuals or not? And the fact that the free world so quickly united around Ukraine, I think, is miraculous. Never before have you seen public opinion so high in the United States and globally among freedom-loving peoples in support of right versus wrong. I think that while Ukraine's internal governance might be complicated, it's not complicated to me that Russia is waging a war of aggression, is trying to erase Ukrainian culture and people. And I'm sure that it's very interesting to get into the nuances of Zelensky's own evolution, and he's a fascinating character. But to me, it's just such an existential thing right now, and Zelensky has to be credited with raising awareness globally. He's very effective, much as Bibi is, actually. He's a very effective orator. He's very clear at making certain that people understand the stakes of what's happening there. So I would say it's no question to me that Zelensky absolutely deserves a spot on our podium.
Yeah, I was going to say a word of defense for Zelensky and Bibi, but you've handled Zelensky so well, so I have nothing to add to that. I believe in Israel, like in America, we're innocent until proven guilty. An indictment is not a conviction, so let's wait and see. In terms of two-state solution and territorial concessions, that was killed by Ariel Sharon with a disengagement. There is a permanent, I would argue, majority, certainly in Israeli political life, that does not have a stomach for territorial concessions right now. And that extends far beyond the Bibi dynamic, right? This is Lapid, who launched his first campaign in Ariel settlement. That's Lieberman, that's Bennett, whatever exists, that's Gantz. You know, really, the positions that you're sort of advocating are maybe represented by Meretz, labor that barely exists. That's a very, very small margin of Israeli society. There is no stomach in Israeli public life since 2005, and I would say as a product of the collective experience of Israelis from making territorial concessions and what that has wrought on their children, their sons and daughters, the military, the country, bringing it to a standstill over and over again, putting their kids into harm's way over and over and over again. That ended with a disengagement, and Bibi was really just the shepherd of what followed it.
I'm reluctant to take that on, so I think I'm going to leave it. I think it takes a broader discussion. My own view is Bibi has shown pettiness and poor judgment again and again and again and again, to the point where he's really jeopardized what he hopes to do. And while it's a broad topic, let's just mention his book. I read his book. I was shocked by the viciousness of his attacks on Obama and Clinton. And if only on the grounds he's an active politician. He was running for prime minister. And somehow he thought that it was good for the interests of Israel, for a man who might be its next prime minister, to issue that kind of an attack on the most popular two men in the Democratic Party at a time when there was a Democratic administration, and at a time when all people are going to read that book and take that as a reflection on their ideals and the political organization of which they are a part. Why would he do that? How is that a wise political move? Isn't that kind of indicative, reflective of the pettiness that has unfortunately characterized so much of his time in office? It's just one example that jumped out at me as I read the book.
I agree with your framing in terms of, David, I think the vast majority of Israelis see things as you do. I would just put a fine point on it. I don't think Sharon's disengagement killed the Israeli left. I think the reality of Palestinian terrorism that flourished in Gaza and the West Bank in response to that is what killed the Israeli left.
That's what I meant.
I think, but I think there is a nafka mina here. I think it's a good thing, and it's the reason that I haven't given up on a two-state solution, even though I don't see a path forward at all right now. I think the impulse to want to stand up for Jewish values and stand up for, I think in the case of Sharon, was absolutely motivated by a desire for peace. I think that's a good thing. I think the consequences and the reality that followed, unfortunately, were disastrous. But I don't think it was foolish, and certainly others can disagree, but I don't think it was foolish to attempt peace, and I certainly hope that we never stop attempting toward peace.
And I would simply say, let's assume that you're right, that Israelis have no stomach for withdrawal. That doesn't make it necessary or wise to expand and to build. If you want to put an end to terrorism, the key when it comes to civilians is separate, separate, separate. Putting more settlers in the midst of Arab-Palestinian, majority areas of the territories. How possibly could that help the situation in the West Bank and lead to a diminution of terrorism? It will do exactly the opposite.
Well, a territory that Israel controls is a territory that Israel can keep safe. That's what we've seen on the ground.
Well, then fine. It controls what it controls and stop expanding into additional territory. That's what I'm saying.
And stop talking about annexation.
And stop talking about annexation and start enforcing the law on the territories.
Look, I have no illusions about the two-state solution. I don't expect to see it. Again, I hope I have many more years ahead of me, but I don't see it on the horizon. What I do think is necessary to keep the idea alive and in play, pending the possibility of change on the other side. And again, as Jews, we say innocent until proven guilty. We don't prejudge, meaning that, sure, the Palestinians have given us every indication that they will never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. Question is, you have to close the door. And what Bibi did, unlike Sharon, was close the door.
There's a fascinating...
Whoa. How do you close the door?
Well, first of all, rhetorically, he said, direct quote, "You will never see a two-state solution as long as I'm prime minister." So in that sense, he closed the door.
And by the way, but he, like so many politicians, speak out of both sides of his mouth. And he's saying one thing one day, another thing the next day. And he has said, on the one hand, I'm in favor of a two-state solution, and on the other hand, there won't be one. What he meant when he said it won't be one is, given the reality that we're facing today, which Steve Bayme just agreed with.
So why promise annexation? Why promise expansion of settlements when little is to be gained and you're closing the door in the process?
So there's a fascinating book, I don't know if you guys have read, written by famous American historians Will and Ariel Durant, called The Lessons of History.
Okay, yeah.
Right. This was a small volume that was written after their 11-volume The Story of Civilization.
And in that book, college, they told us not to read that. It was too,
in the book, there's a chapter called History and War. It's a fascinating read. It sort of stages a conversation between a general and a philosopher. And I remember at the time when the debate was raging between Obama and Netanyahu over how to deal with the Iranians, I was skimming through the book, and it just occurred to me, how consistent these arguments were. So I put together a piece where I sort of paraphrased, changed philosopher to Obama and general to Netanyahu, and you can see the arguments come to life throughout history about how to deal with issues like this. What you're saying makes sense, on a philosophical basis. We all want peace. We don't want to send our children to war. We understand that. But the reality that Israelis have been faced with over decades, is that when they are not in southern Lebanon, Hezbollah is in southern Lebanon, and it fires rockets into Israel. When they are in southern Lebanon, Hezbollah is not there. How long will Israelis continue to allow terror attacks to be launched, for example, from Jenin, from Gaza? I mean, right now, the Israeli military establishment calls it mowing the grass. They don't want to go in, so when the terror buildup becomes enough, they go in and sort of eliminate certain terror cells, but they die, to live another day, right? Or to live to die another day. So the question in the long term is going to be, is this a sustainable scenario? When the Israeli experience is, every piece of territory that you concede right now and based on decades of experience becomes a launch pad to target our children.
But the long-term question is, what's the vision? What's the vision? How do we see some kind of solution that everybody can live with and that is at least basically consistent with our moral values? If there's not a vision, you can't sustain the state, you can't sustain morale, you can't sustain international support. Bibi is a leader. Bibi has an obligation to present a vision for the future. I want to suggest to you, for all his strengths, he hasn't done that. He hasn't done that.
Because there isn't one.
No, I don't agree.
Well, Steve said it, and by the way, you said it earlier.
I don't believe now that it's possible.
Right, but you don't have a vision.
I do.
If you're saying to me a two-state solution, the problem is that is so vague. It has no meaning anymore within the Jewish world, within the state of Israel. I'm for a two-state solution too. By the way, I have not met yet a person who isn't for a two-state solution. but it's always way the hell down the road because it has no meaning now. And for a vision that is not based in reality, that's Wizard of Oz stuff. And
are we annexing territories? Are we expanding settlements?
And by the way,
are we applying the law when it comes to hilltop youth? Are we doing these things or not? All of that is part of a vision statement. And you can't put those questions aside as if somehow they're irrelevant. If you believe in those things, then you have to have a vision that justifies them. And then, if not, you have to have a vision that justifies them as well.
I'm not sure I agree with Bibi's vision on this, but his vision and the vision of those he represents is that, yes, we will annex more and more of the West Bank, and that ultimately there will be Palestinians living on a small area of the West Bank, but because they're not making peace with us, it should not preclude our moving forward in ways that will help the Israeli people. And most Israelis who live on the West Bank are not there for ideological reasons. They're there for economic reasons. And that at the moment, the place to buy a house, if you're a young couple, is the West Bank. And if that's true, that is it.
Last thing I'll say, look, I believe in a Jewish and democratic Israel. That's what I believe in. There are a number of ways we can get there, but as long as we're committed to a Jewish and democratic Israel, I'm fine. And if we're not committed to a Jewish and democratic Israel, then it's not Zionism. So anybody on the right who has a vision to get us there, perfectly okay with me.
Fair enough. All right, so I draw it to a close this way. As you look at 2023, in terms of being a Jew, are you optimistic or are you pessimistic? Are you looking forward to 2023 because you expect good things to happen? Are you anxious about 2023 because you're worried about where we may go? Laura.
I'm not sure if we're standing on the precipice of something really wonderful or something really terrible for the Jewish future. That's the honest truth. There's a lot of warning signs on a lot of different metrics, anti-Semitism being one of them. I am simply trying to focus on the things that I can control, which, to paraphrase Rumi, the poet, is not others, but really myself. And for me, meaningfully connecting with Judaism within my own self and expanding outward is really the only thing we have control over. So I guess I'm an optimist at heart. I think there's a lot of, whether or not you want to be pessimistic or optimistic, there's lots of evidence that you can use to build your case. But I would say that your time will probably be more enjoyable if you remain an optimist.
What do you think?
This debate between optimists and pessimists, again, didn't begin yesterday. The place of the Jew has always been on the optimistic side. In other words, the Jew looks at reality and says, present reality is not necessarily permanent. So in that respect, the room for optimism is there. It's the evidence behind it, buttressing it, is that there's been no point in Jewish history in which Jews have as many opportunities to lead a creative Jewish life, such as the ones Laura mentioned and many others, both here and in Israel, so that there are good grounds for optimism. Instead of pessimism, I would use the word forebodings. I have a lot of forebodings, primarily about Israel. In terms of America, there's storms, and we should be concerned about those storms, but again, I have a lot of faith in the direction of American history, which has been towards a more inclusive society. So in that respect, I'd say we'll weather the storms here. There'll be some rocky points along the way, but again, the grounds for optimism is strong, and we should try to build upon that. Notwithstanding the forebodings, which are both about anti-Semitism and about assimilation. As far as Israel is concerned, frankly, in this respect, I guess one could make the case for Bibi really is the person of 2023, that probably nothing more in Jewish life will depend upon what he does and does not do than Bibi Netanyahu's actions. So in that respect, we can reconvene in 12 months and see how we evaluate
yes, but
them.
you open the door.
Yeah.
Are you optimistic or pessimistic now about what he is likely to do?
Okay. I am optimistic that legislation is not likely to happen. I am pessimistic about the rhetoric that will come out of people who are not in the West Bank for security reasons. They're in the West Bank because they believe God gave them the West Bank. And the rights of Arabs and others there are irrelevant. And to use Bezalel Smotrich's words, democracy is not the key to understanding the Jewish future, or words to that effect. When you have people like that in the government, I have a lot of concerns.
Okay. All right, where are you?
I'm bullish on the Jewish people. We've been here for 3,000 years. Hell of a track record. Not because I would diminish the concerns that everybody's expressed here, the challenges, but only because we really are in a relatively blessed position in terms of the tools that we have at our disposal. A state, a military, a vibrant economy, a diplomatic corps, newspapers, journalists, digital platforms to be able to make our case and fight for our corner. I would say not since the days that King Solomon sat on the throne in Jerusalem have we been so blessed.
Beautiful, Dave. All right, where are you?
I'm an optimist always. In the coming year, Jews will do what they've always done, which is to figure out a way to make Judaism work. So Jews, pray, study, do mitzvot, commit yourself to the Jewish people and to the state of Israel. And I'm confident that will happen.
Amen v'amen. All four of you are fabulous. I thank you for giving me so much time, for sharing your understanding and your wisdom with the JBS audience. I hope you appreciate how unique it is to have four people of your stature and your intellect and your heart all talking together. And I am flattered that you're here, and I'm honored that you're here, and it makes me feel wonderful, because it's what I always wanted JBS to do. What I wanted JBS to do was have the four of you at this table. And I love you all, and we will just continue to get together as the year progresses, 2023. I wish all of you a healthy and prosperous new year, one where you get to spend time with family and people you love, and where you get to do things that interest you and which also enable you to share creativity with all the people around you. And I hope you will always make time to sit on JBS, because what you could contribute is a treasure. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. The thoughts of David Efune, Laura Adkins, Stephen Bayme, and Eric Yoffie. Please be in touch with me this week. Did we miss anything? And who would you choose as your Jewish Person of the Year in 2022? Please write me at rabbigolub@jbstv.org. And finally, we're at that season, where most of us make our final decisions about where will we put our tzedakah dollars. And there's so many worthwhile causes and organizations all asking us for their support. And I speak to you, our JBS audience. I know many of you, if not all of you, appreciate what we're trying to do here. Appreciate the programming that we provide 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And then there are moments when I get to sit with the kind of panelists that you've heard speak about 2022 and as we emerge into 2023. And there's something precious about being able to sit with this kind of group and share it with you, and it's there for you anytime. We care about you. Everyone who works here at JBS cares about you. And we want there to be a channel that you can come to which affirms your Jewish identity, affirms your Jewish soul, affirms your love of the state of Israel, affirms your love of the Jewish people, and affirms your love of Torah, of the Judaism, and what makes our people so unique and distinct. There's one channel in America that does that, that is with you, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's JBS. And so if I didn't need to ask, I wouldn't ask. But I need to ask, because the only way we can do an American channel 24 hours a day, 7 days a week is with the funding needed to produce this channel. And there are those of you who send us $36. I treasure you. And there are those of you who send us 100 and 1,000 and 5,000. And then there are people who send us 4 figures and 5 figures. And like every other nonprofit that is going to operate, the only way we can survive is if those of you with real means also. I hope you'll go out of your way to make a sizable gift at the end of this year so that when we hit 2023, you'll see this kind of panel very, very often. And to all of you who will make JBS possible, my deepest and most profound thanks. You can make your contribution by sending a check to JBS at Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can go to our JBS website, click on Donate, and make your contribution by credit card or PayPal. Or you can call the JBS pledge line. The number is on your screen, and you can call and make your pledge, and someone will get back to you. Those are the 3 ways you can make sure JBS is with you in 2023, and you don't have to worry that next December will come and you won't see Steve. My thanks as always to our director, Sloan Copeland, beautiful job. To our production coordinators, Michael Paley and Serge Goldberg. To our managing director, Dara Golub. And to our senior producer, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'chaim, my friends, to life.
Jewish education in media.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS pledge line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.